books I like to read in those foreign languages. Today, I want to talk about a recent success story I had, which was that I went from essentially zero knowledge of Japanese to around an N5 level in about 6 weeks. It's hard to tell exactly how many weeks or days I took because I had a sort of a ramping up period at the beginning and I had a ramping down period at the end. But definitely for 5 weeks and something in the middle, I was focusing quite a bit on Japanese, and I was using a very specific system, a selection of 4 different resources, websites, and applications every day in order to make progress. And I think it worked pretty well. So this video is here to share with you what I did and provide some tips as well as some of the difficulties that I faced. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the first of the 4. I'm going to go over what it is, why you should use it, and also whether it costs any money. The first resource I used is called Anki. This is very common for people who are either in med school or they're language learners. It doesn't matter if you use Anki or any other resource. The point is, I used a space repetition system. So every single day, and because I'm very dedicated, I know exactly what time of day that is. And for me, it's 10 p.m. for whatever reason. I think because I change time zones too much. My reviews reset. So at 10 p.m. every day, I had a bunch of Japanese flashcards that I knew I had to review, and I knew that I would have to do that at 10 p.m. And so, like clockwork, I was getting them done. Some people make their own flashcards from scratch. Some people, like what I did here, download a deck that is publicly available. I did this. I found a deck that's called Core Japanese Vocabulary. It has around 37,000 cards, so it's huge. But many of these cards aren't necessary if you're just learning the JLPT, or they're very advanced words or variations of words that you don't need to know. The important part is, if you see here on the left, it has subdecks, and if you want to learn just the cards for the N5, you can just study those cards. So there are 1,000 and something cards in here. And most people say you need to know about 1,000 words for the JLPT N5, which would come up to about 2,000 cards. So these are flashcards, as you can see, composed of mostly words, a few expressions, but not really any grammar points. On one side you have the word in Japanese, and on the other side you have the word in English. And once you get to the other side, that's when it gives you the pronunciation of the kanji. You definitely need to, at the very least, know kana, hiragana, katakana, and this should take you about a day or two if you're focused. So you can't really start using a deck like this until you at least have gone over kana. But if you're serious about learning Japanese, this is something that should take you a very, very short amount of time. And because you see the kana everywhere, you will continue to reinforce them as you start learning your kanji. Now, the thing about Anki is that it gets spoken about a lot in language learning circles because it is very easy to invest a lot of time into memorizing tons and tons of words, but you need to actually see them in context for them to stick in your head. So you can't just use spaced repetition to learn a language. It's just one more tool that can be overused or underused. So the good thing is that if you want to use Anki, which for the record is free for just about everyone unless you're using it on a iOS device, but of course, who does that nowadays, is you want to combine these N5 decks you can either make yourself or find on the internet with a software or a website where you can read a lot. I am definitely biased because of who pays my salary, but the software, the platform I use for reading in Japanese is called Link, L-I-N-G-Q. It has a free version, it has a paid version. The paid version has additional features and so on, but if you want to try it out, you can always try it out for free. Essentially, if you choose your language, and I've chosen Japanese here, you get sent into a library where you have, sort of like with Netflix, you have different shelves on different topics: newsfeed, podcasts, kids, grammar, science, culture, whatever. And you can set your filter depending on how fluent you are. I am not at all fluent in Japanese, so as you can see here, I have my filter set to beginner. And you find stuff you want to read with that is interesting for you. In the case of Japanese, I decided to take it easy and start with Link's Japanese mini stories, of which there are 60. Essentially, they are 60 very short stories that use a lot of repetition and that for the most part use vocabulary from the N5. There are occasional words and grammar points that might come from N4, N3, and so on, but for the most part, the stories are very simple. So when I clicked on the very first story, I opened it up, I get a story. It has a series of pages. We're looking at the first page here. You can look at an entire page at once or just go sentence by sentence. And for all the text that you see, I've gone through this story once before, so essentially every single word is known, which means there's no highlight. But if you had any word that is new to you, like this one, for whatever reason, it would be highlighted in blue. So that word can then, you can click on a word and you can see the translation of it, whether it's, for example, maesa, which means every morning. And if you feel like you need to have this word be noted as a word that is new to you, that you have trouble understanding, you can click on a definition and you'll make a link and then you'll save it. So basically, Link in essence is a collection of content on different topics, and it's a way of tracking every single word that you do or don't know. And as you continue to read, you'll see this is the number of words that Link says I know, 753. Over time, that will go higher and higher. If you click on here, you can see the other languages I have. So, Spanish, I'm at somehow exactly 20,000 because I just kept reading and I kept adding more and more words over time that I said that I knew. So 60 of these stories exist in Japanese. They're very simple. There's a lot of repetition. The first time you hear a story, it's from one person's perspective, and then halfway through the lesson, they change to have it from sometimes a first-person perspective. I am a cook and I work in a restaurant, or from the perspective of someone else. So it becomes a way of sort of repeating the same text and seeing it from different angles. And for the most part, these stories are very simple. So what I would do when I was just using my Anki with these words, I would see all these words like asa for morning over and over again. But to really learn them, you have to actually use them in context. By use in this case, I mean see them and listen to them and go, yes, that is the word for morning, and I'm hearing it in a sentence where they're talking about what time they wake up in the morning or whatever. And it's then being stuck in my brain that much more effectively than if I were to just see it on a flashcard every day, floating by itself, in an empty void. So I would go over these stories not just once, but I would keep reading them over and over again, because every time I see that word each morning or every morning, it would be further ingrained inside me. And it actually helped me as well with my Anki, because then when I would do my Anki reviews, I would be going, yes, I've seen this word. And so it became easier. So the two help each other. And of course, with Link, you have access to the text. You also have access to the audio, and you can access the audio for every individual sentence if you want by pressing this little button here. So I can also start to hear the sentences spoken by an actual person, not by a robot like in Google Translate, and it helps further reinforce it. And for the most part, these stories are spoken in a relatively normal manner, so they're not spoken too quickly, but they're also not spoken. Sometimes you have those news stories that are spoken so slowly and so simply that it almost doesn't help you learn the language, because no one would ever speak that way. So getting some real benefit to your listening ability from this is also important. So Link is free, as I said. You can be a premium member. It has a monthly subscription, but at the very least, if this is the kind of website you'd want to use to try out learning Japanese, you can try it out for free first and then make a decision. And it is the main platform that I use to find stuff to read with. Of course, sometimes when you're learning a language that is very foreign like Japanese, for me as an Anglophone at least, you would go through a sentence and you would say, I understand every single word here, but I don't really get what's going on in the sentence because the grammar, the construction of the sentence is just different than what I'm used to. And for that, there are tons of resources available for Japanese, but personally, I used JLPT Sensei. This is a website. Again, it's essentially free, although you can pay to have access to sort of PDFs of all their stuff, and apparently it's ad-free. I haven't paid, and I think it's perfectly fine with the free version. Essentially, if you click on, say, N5 and go to their grammar list, you'll have a list of every single grammar point relevant to the JLPT N5. And if you click on one of them, it opens a page for that grammar point. And you can have a little card here, and then you can see also some example sentences. So you have a few examples to really show yourself, okay, this is what it means when they have this going on in a sentence. So every time I would read something in Link and get to a sentence where there is something going on that I just seem incapable of understanding, I would isolate what that is, I would search for it, and I would usually end up back here because JLPT Sensei was usually the top Google search result. For example, if you type in a couple of characters that you don't know, and then you type in Japanese grammar into Google, you're probably going to get a JLPT Sensei link in essentially the top result. One caveat I can say is that I know some people in the Japanese learning community say that sometimes the website is less than perfect, that it says things that aren't fully correct. But maybe some of these comments are written a couple of years ago. Everything I've seen, as far as I can tell, seems correct. At the very least, the lower levels. Maybe if you were to continue to the N2, the N1, and so on, you would get to more questionable stuff when the grammar gets more advanced. But if you're just beginning, it seems pretty good. And finally, I've claimed at the start of this video that I made it to the rough level of an N5, that I could pass the N5 if I were to take it. But how do I know that? Well, you need to actually be able to do N5 level questions. There are lots of free resources out there. I found one particular website. It's called JapaneseTest4U.com to be the best because it has, if you see here, we scroll down to N5, 126 different pages full of questions. They have grammar questions, kanji questions, listening, reading, vocabulary. What we're seeing right now in front of you is the first one for vocabulary. So as you see here, there's a blank, there's a sentence, there's always 4 answer choices, and you choose the answer which you think is most appropriate. If you scroll down, you also get the new words that they think you don't know yet. These are for the most part words that you're only going to see on the N5. So you're not going to have words from N3 or N2 on here. Although occasionally they do show up. It's not perfect, but of course there is no fixed vocabulary list for these JLPT tests. And if you scroll all the way down, you also get the answers. So this is very helpful to test your vocabulary. And when you're learning something like Japanese, sometimes it's important to limit yourself just to the vocabulary that you want to learn. Because if you were to go and open an actual news article right now in Japanese, you would see so many location names, city names, people's names, and so on, that it would be very hard to, you say, okay, yes, I want to understand this, but at the same time, there's so much more here that than what I'm specifically starting out with, which is just beginner Japanese. So these little sentences and these texts are JLPT N5 material, which makes it very useful. When I first started doing them, I was getting a ton of them wrong, and there'd be many where I'd be going, okay, you know, and I'm looking at the answer choices, and because it's the N5, there's not a lot of kanji used. You can see it's mostly kana. I had a lot of difficulty, but I went through most. I would say of the 126, I was going through at one point about 5 to 7 pages of these every day. And now I would get just about everyone correct. Most of them, maybe 8 or 9 on 10. Because all these words that they're asking, all these verbs and so on, the words you see here, I've seen them over and over again. And I've seen them in my Anki. I've seen them in Link. I've seen them sometimes used as example sentences when you look up grammar points in JLPT and now I'm seeing them on the actual test similar questions. And so it becomes very natural. I'm not scared. I'm not intimidating. I say, oh, yes, these are the words. I know what to do. So to summarize, I used an SRS software to give myself every day new repetitions and new cards to do. I set it so that over the course of 6 weeks, I knew how many new cards I was doing. I knew that I would be essentially through most of the cards by that point. I think about 75% of the N5 cards in my Japanese deck are currently mature, which means that I've gotten them right a bunch of times in a row. I used Link as a resource to read and listen a lot, and not just one time for each story, but over and over again, because I found it helps when I'm just a beginner. I used JLPT Sensei to help me with the grammar, and I used JapaneseTestForYou.com. By the way, I think there also is a paid version for this, probably a few dollars, and you get access to bigger PDFs, but this is essentially free for anyone if you want. I use JapaneseTestForYou.com to practice actual JLPT questions. I did this over the course of 6 weeks. I don't know exactly how many hours I was doing a day, but in the middle, I would say I was definitely up to maybe a solid 3 hours a day. Yeah, 3 hours a day on average, combining all of these together. And in the end, I have a very solid understanding of N5 vocabulary and grammar points, as well as some amount of vocabulary from beyond that, because those are words I just happen to run into. In terms of the issues with this strategy, because no language learning strategy is perfect, number one, I would say it's hard to learn words that have kanji, because most words in Japanese use kanji, and then go through texts that don't use a lot of kanji. It can be a bit tough because it relies on you really knowing how they're pronounced, especially when there are verbs involved that are conjugated, and then you have to tell which verb it is, even though if you just had that kanji there to replace the kana, it would be so much easier. So if I could, I wish I could go, for example, through JapaneseTestForYou.com and replace lots of this kana with more kanji, because it's how actual Japanese tend to read, and it's also a lot easier to read with. Second, it's hard when you're learning a language like Japanese to keep yourself just focused on the words you want to know and not to start learning stuff from the N4, the N3, the N2. I think the reality is you have to strike a bit of a balance. You have to focus on the words that you want to learn, but also accept that you will be picking up some other words along the way. And that does take a bit of your brain power. It takes a bit of your energy. So the resources I used are not perfect. For example, Link's stories are very good, but they're not specifically N5 stories. It's more just general beginner stories, and there are some N4 words and there are some N3 words in there. You have to accept that no single method is going to isolate you just in the words that you want to learn for the test. And you're going to always learn some other stuff around it, but of course that's good, because it means in the future you'll be more ready when you decide to take that next step and go for the N4. So this is my strategy that I used. If you have any comments, questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to continue on with my Japanese at least until I get to the N4, I suspect, which I'm partway there, but I'm not there yet. And then perhaps I'll make another video updating, and I can always go into more detail in future videos on exactly how I do my repetitions, what methods I used to get those Anki cards to stick in my head, to get the pronunciation, to get the meaning stuck in my head. There are a lot of details to go into this, but this is sort of a general overview of the strategies that I used. Thanks for watching.